Hello and welcome to Carbon Clarity, the podcast for the carbon curious. I'm your host, Kev Cooling, founder and managing director of Hut22 Limited, and I'm delighted to be joined today by Elina Grigoriou, director of Grigoriou Interiors and the co-founder and chair of the new Ska Rating board. Elina,
Hello.
fantastic to have you here. How
Thank
are
you
you?
very much. I'm very well, very well. Very delighted to be invited and have an opportunity to see you again.
Brilliant. Yes, I know it's been a while, isn't it? We were just talking before we started recording, and we won't reflect on the number of years it's been since we spoke last. Um,
I think it's
so,
a good indicator. I think it's a good indicator. It shows how long we've been working in this arena.
well, that is true. That is very true, and it's kind of, yeah, you know what? The only thing that's true is it keeps getting longer. So, what I'd love to do to start with is just tell the listeners a little bit about you, a little bit about your career, if that's okay. So maybe, if you don't mind, give us a few minutes on that, how you got to where you are today.
Thank you, Kev. So I was born and brought up in Greece in the middle of nowhere. And I always mention that because I think it gave me a real appreciation of nature, of the elements, of systems, and how things are structured. So I grew up, beside the sea. And I really experienced, I guess, the changes in nature and environment within Greece itself at the time. We had lots of fires at the time also.
Yeah.
So lots of, my father's livelihood was in danger of really being burnt down from
Oh, wow.
normal
Okay.
nature fires. So that has only grown as a problem, but that was something that I was acutely aware. Shortage of water. We used to have 1 hour of water a day when I grew up in the summertime. So, there were acute things. So for me, the environment, nature
Absolutely.
was
Yeah.
always something I grew up very much in contact with and doing good. I don't know, everybody I'm sure is doing that, but I grew up in a family that was always trying to do the right thing, do good. And so definitely I had that, in my ear
That's a
growing
great
up.
principle to get
Uh,
instilled at a young age, isn't it?
it is. Well, I'm grateful, whatever. And
Yeah.
I don't know what I've done with it, but we'll see. So, and I wanted to be an interior designer when I was around 15. I don't know why. I had none around me. I only had an engineer that was procured to build, refurbish my parents' house. But I wanted to be an interior designer from 15. And then that sort of then got a side tour because I became a professional basketball player then in my late teens. I moved to Athens, finished high school, and when I was being training and everything.
Yeah.
And so that, though I saw, female sports isn't very well paid or anything. No, the
Right.
projection, especially at the time,
Right.
wasn't very appealing. And my mother and my siblings had moved back to England. My mother's English, and my sister said, "Hey, there are courses on interior design in UK universities and everything. Come, let's do this." So I sort of went back on track and went and did a BA in interior design.
Okay.
Graduated, got straight into the industry, and then worked for 10 years for two different sort of more architectural practices where
Uh-huh.
interiors obviously were part of
Yes, of
that.
course. Yeah.
And I'd say probably in the first 2 months of my first job at PDP, a lovely team there, which were based in Surrey, I started reading material impacts on human health. And I think it was vinyl flooring and the toxicity for
Yeah.
firefighters.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, right.
And
Okay. That's interesting. Yeah.
it is exactly, and it really, and I remember the moment of reading, this sort of, I can't remember what magazine it was, maybe Building Design or something like that, where this was being reported, and it really obviously set the tone of issues that I had to consider in the specification that I was making as a designer. And so and then throughout the next sort of at least 7 years of my first company, I was more and more aware, and I was that designer that was keep asking those questions, to material reps, the difficult one, that's going to ask that sustainability data.
Yeah.
So that just grew as a thing, and I was learning on the go and really pushing materials, really researching in my own time. um and not much, I guess, would be implemented, but people were, open to listen, but it was very much an entertainment thing for them.
Yeah.
And then moving into another company in central London, I did think about starting my own business before I made the move, because I thought, again, kind of how do I move the dial forwards to what I consider the right specification, the right design
Yep.
within another company. I also had, again, sort of that sound, that voice in my ear here of my father, who always thought, oh, my daughters are always going to be business owners. I definitely grew up with my dad always giving me that image, basically, and I thank him
Right.
for it.
Okay. Yeah,
for
brilliant.
sure. That was him. But he was always very proud of his daughters and his son, to do that. So that was really important to have that. So I guess whether I would have done it if he hadn't, sort of put that idea in my head, I don't know. But that was a question I asked, and I thought, no, needed more experience, needed sort of, more
Yep.
years under my
Yep.
belt.
Yep.
Went into another company, and there again, sort of these sustainability issues were sort of coming in more into play in the industry, and I could push more. So then I remember this briefing came up from Skansen at the time, Febber Monsell and Rix, which said, oh, there's some kind of assessment sort of methodology idea we've got. Who's interested to come and hear a breakfast briefing? And this was the day after I had made a call to another institution that, in theory, has assessment methodologies that could do a scheme and had a scheme, but it was more for major projects. And they said they weren't interested. So I was a bit sort of stuck.
Okay.
So, literally the next morning I was at this briefing that was talking about Ska Rating. And they said, who's interested? I mean, I think I was literally the first person to shove my hand up, me, because I had come to that point over that initial stage of my career where I could see we needed that sort of carrot for clients to get something.
And we ought to say, for those who aren't familiar, the Ska Rating is a tool to assess the environmental impact of fit outs in buildings. That's what it's for, isn't it?
It's fit outs. So it's fit out and refurbishment of an existing building.
Yeah.
So it's measuring the design decisions and the actual then impact in the delivery of an interior design and fit out delivery project.
Yeah. Brilliant, great. So you're at this second company. You got involved in the Ska Rating, and then at some point,
I was made redundant. And then I was made redundant.
Is it right? Do you know what? That's interesting. That so often that's the trigger, isn't it? That's the thing. You think, well, what have I got to lose? I might as well.
Well, actually, I felt really annoyed. I felt, I was thinking not to leave before, and because I was thinking about it, and of course, 2008. So the economic crisis then and everything. So I thought, I wanted to start my own company, but I thought, no, it's not the right climate. Just stay another year, etc. And then in the meeting where my directors at the time were telling me, sorry, it's expensive, can't keep you on. We're not getting the work in. And I was like, in my mind, I'm like, thank God, and damn it, I didn't do the move myself, before. And it was just, ego completely. But it was honestly the best thing that could have happened. And after the initial shock, and I think it's important that everybody talks about this. It's not a thing to feel bad about. It's business decisions. Now I have my own business. I get to see what it's like. And at the time, I was pretty cool about it. I understood it was a business decision. I was too expensive for what they were getting in and stuff like that. And it gave me that ability then to really then get on with my project, which was the business Grigoriou Interiors, which then I set up pretty much. Actually, talking of careers and trajectories, I gave myself 5 days to figure out.
Oh, well done.
I know, right? The luxury. Well, honestly, I've had there was no money, to be able to afford to stay on longer. And so I couldn't afford to wait longer. Both financially, but also, because I'm 100%. If I'm going to do something, I'm going to do it properly. So for me, I take time to reflect, but then I act. So I thought if I was stopping myself from jumping head in, and doing this thing that I was just so convinced, I needed, as a purpose that I have internally. But how I did it, I remember I just thought, I'm just going to write down anything that comes to my mind, and I'm going to do nothing else, and just reflect, just really, sitting for 5 days to think about what you're going to do, it's quite a lot of time if that's all you're doing, to a degree.
I guess so.
So, and I am quite good at crisis management, let's say, probably, and I've had a lot of it in my life, just all family situations and everything. So I'm probably geared up that way, right or wrongly. So I took 5 days to think about what else did I want to do before I just put 100% of myself into this company, into this life. And so I had gallery owners and West End show producer, you name it. There's still and those things are still there. They're the fun things I want to do in life, but any of those ideas are all basically underpinned by this planet being stable and being okay.
Oh
So
yeah.
anything else I can think of doing in my life that I think is fun and pleasurable and good and has a great purpose is all really relying on the environment in which we're hosted in being actually stable, first
Yep.
of all, and working well and flourishing. And then, by consequence, I, who am relying on it, can flourish too.
Absolutely.
So
Yeah.
in this sort of very black and white brain of mine, that just was very simple, and it still is. And I'm still kind of dreaming, of the day I'll be able to do my hobby, which is actually design again to a
Yeah,
degree.
so all you need to do is fix climate change, and then you'll be ready to go to the
Yes,
West End.
yes,
So,
exactly, exactly.
so you started Grigoriou Interiors, and
Yeah.
straight from the off, it had a really strong. There's a really strong focus on sustainability and that kind of thing. So, how has that kind of changed over the last, what would it be now, 16 years or something? Is that obviously that we know the landscape's really evolved in that time, hasn't it? But in terms
Yeah.
of your approach to it, how do you kind of think about that these days at the company?
I would say the purpose of what I started with and where we are today is exactly the same. Nothing has
Yeah,
changed. It is
fantastic.
about inherent sustainability, and that including the three pillars of sustainability, which is environment, social well-being, and economic and value. Nothing is a good project, a good design, unless it's capturing those three and it's balancing the impacts of those three. Yeah, so that 100% hasn't changed. If anything, it's been perhaps fleshed out more. It's more clean cut about how we can actually provide help more to clients today. So it's evolved really within the same
Hmm.
trajectory.
Fantastic. So it's great that you're still involved in Ska after all those years, from day one right the way through to now, and you're so
Yeah.
kind of fundamental to it moving forward. Because fit outs, what we ought to say that for those people who don't perhaps work in the built environment, who aren't involved in construction and things, we ought to perhaps just explain what we mean by a fit out. And we're going to go on to talk about some new research that's just been published, and that talks about this idea of a cat B fit out. So I wonder if you could maybe just explain to people what a fit out is and what a cat A and a cat B fit out is.
Of course, thank you very much for the question. So I guess everybody's familiar, the building they're probably perhaps listening to this podcast in or looking at a building, if you're maybe not on the seaside. But buildings are usually owned by one party and maybe fitted out and used by another when it comes to commercial or public, mostly interiors. When it maybe even with rental accommodation when it comes to residential. So you have that split of ownership, and which also will dictate who is responsible for the brief, the budget, the maintenance, and then maybe even the end of life. And so projects, so you may have a project to build a building, and that's the whole shell and the central sort of structures and services. And then you'll have what kind of is the bits inside it. And usually it's the pretty things. Everybody thinks of interiors as all
Yeah.
pretty things, yeah? So it could be the wallpaper or the floor finish or a ceiling and the chair you're sitting on, the bed you're lying in, the light fittings. And those usually we call all of that the fit out. So it's the fitting out of a building with all the things. Now, you can think of it sometimes also about if you tipped a building upside down, what would fall from it. So usually that also can help in the understanding between the base build structure and the architecture and then the stuff inside that gets changed. And this is the thing, and this is why it's so important to understand the difference between these two elements, because the thinking of sustainability is completely different. So I know, I mentioned this before, that I really want us to talk about this because it's something that gets packaged together in the thinking, and everybody thinks in a building wide way for
Yep.
interior fit out.
Yep.
And when that happens, we create unsustainable results. And that's why I've been involved right at the beginning, especially with Ska Rating, because we're trying to create a voice in the industry for fit out. So it's not in the
Yep.
shadow of whole building thinking, and it's done correctly for sustainability and also
Yeah.
great value. It's about value. You've got many baby business owners or consultants who are or members of teams who are trying to maybe work or learn in a university or exercise in a gym. We're all using spaces for a purpose, and I'll class that as performance. We're trying to perform well in whatever we're doing. It could be sleeping well in a hotel room. It could be
Yeah.
running well and happily on a treadmill. It could
Yep.
be sitting in a desk listening to a teacher or professor. It could be
Yep.
sitting at a desk to try and write a report. And all of these are tasks where we want to perform good or better, or
Yep.
sometimes even survive and make do, right? It could be so
Yep.
dire. And so for me, that's value. That's not the cost of running a space. It's the value that space is producing as a tool for life.
Yep.
And so there are costs, though, to creating that space, and there are environmental costs, and there are economic costs, and there are also social costs. So I'd really, really encourage anybody who's listening to think about the value and the cost also of spaces and how we maintain them, how we even buy them in the beginning,
Yep.
separately for the interior fit out to the whole building, because we make
Yes.
better decisions of investment by the right people who can make a decision, basically.
Yeah. And quite often it's the case, isn't it, that when that team gets together and they design the whole building, when I think about the shell of the building, as you talked about, quite often the building will be occupied by one or more people, but probably, as you say, or often it's the case it's not the people who build the building in the first place.
Yeah.
So when you're offering that building onto the market, you want to make it as flexible as possible for the people who are coming in. So there's big open spaces, and they need to be divided up into offices or different areas or sections or whatever it might be. So there's all of that and all of the kind of tweaks and changes, but they don't very often they don't leave it. It's not completely empty, is it, that space when people first walk in? So it's been fitted out to a degree, and that's what we call the Cat A fit out, right? So that there's like a base level of stuff that's in there already.
Yeah, but that's also we talk about category A and category B kind of projects, mostly in office buildings. They don't apply to
Yes, that's
other
right.
sectors.
That's right.
Yeah, so just to be clear on that for anybody who's not aware of that, it does help though, because you do still do certain projects like that in other buildings, but
Yeah.
more rarely. So category A is usually the works the landlord would do to, I guess, preempt maybe some of the basic things that they think
Yeah.
an occupant will want, a tenant will want. So that's what they are. I mean, in general terms, if anybody's familiar with a commercial office building, they may not be aware, but the floor they're standing on is usually lifted up, and it has an access void underneath it where cables go through.
Yeah.
And that's more modern office construction. So we call that a raised access floor. So we also make it accessible. And the same thing applies to the ceiling. So the ceiling is suspended. So it's hanging from maybe a concrete soffit or timber soffit, maybe, who knows?
Who
We
knows?
wish. And that is then also accessible. So maybe those ceiling tiles, maybe everybody's familiar with in open plan offices or meeting rooms. Those are both two systems that go in as a Cat A.
Yeah.
By landlord. Yeah.
And then Cat B is the kind of the stuff that the incoming tenant will say, okay, well, this is how we want our space to look. This is the kind of brand that we've got, or this is the kind of functions that we need in the space. And that's what happens in that Cat B fit out sort of exercise.
That's right. So the furniture, maybe the desks, maybe the floor finish, the carpets or linoleum or whatever it is, or tiling, the joinery, the banquet seating or the tea points, all of that is what we'll call category B project stuff. Yeah.
And it's that bit that you're saying, that's the bit where this keeping it on the office context, because it's the focus of this research. But so that's the element that people just don't really pay enough attention to in terms of particularly the kind of environmental impact.
Yes, that's absolutely right. Yes, it's increasing. I don't want to talk about absolutes because it's not an absolute. It's an increasing. Is it enough? No way. We're not even close.
Yeah.
Is it encouraging? Yes. But we literally have to make it as normal as asking for the financial cost, because it is. At the moment we're basically completely over budget environmentally, and we're not even aware that we should be asking for a budget. So
that's such a great way of putting it, isn't it? Because we're so used to thinking about the financial cost of a project, and no project moves forward without a pretty solid understanding of the budget, does it? Even though, we know full well that those things often kind of change, but it's much rarer. It's becoming more common, as you say, but it's much rarer to kind of think about a carbon budget for a project. And that's where this piece of research comes in, right?
It does
Which
indeed.
which is called Counting the Upfront Carbon in Cat B Office Fit Out, which is quite a lengthy, which is why I just wanted to clarify for people what we meant by Cat B Fit Out. And I'll maybe just to think about the upfront carbon bit as well, just so people can kind of understand that there's carbon associated with every stage of a building's life cycle, from the moment any materials are extracted from the ground, their processing, their transportation, their installation, their maintenance and refurbishment over time, and the end of life as well. So the upfront bit is just that bit right near the front.
Yes, absolutely. And I think life cycles, let's talk about life cycles also, because that is really important as a term, maybe to add in this conversation. First, we use the word life cycles to talk about the beginning and the ending and the repeat. So how long, and it's all about time. And sustainability is all about time, and it's the decision that's sustainable. So I always make a real point about this. No material is inherently got the sort of characteristic of sustainability, right? So that is a really key point to make. And it doesn't apply just to construction industry, it applies to finance, it applies to travel, right? Everything, clothing purchases. The decision is sustainable or not the product or the material itself.
So is what you're saying there, can I interpret that as meaning that in the right context, some things may be sustainable and other things not, but in a different context, it might be flipped, because there might be a really good plastics is a great example, isn't it? Plastic is an amazing material in the right context and used for the right purpose.
And plastics is a big word to use for many different chemical consistencies.
Right, exactly. So in the right context, if you're in the medical profession and you need something that's super sterile. I am. And something that's super sterile and you need that, then yes, plastics does that well, or whatever. But in lots of situations, it's used badly. Anyway, carry on, please. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
So life cycles, I think, is basically one of the parameters of making a sustainable decision. And so that's about time and the ability for product, a material, or the whole space itself to do multiple cycles of use. And that is important because you may have 10 kilos of carbon that have been sort of emitted in the manufacturing stage of a chair, and you're going to use it for 2 years or 10 years. And so that sort of 10 kilos will either be diluted over 10 years and avoid the purchase of another 5 chairs, at 2-year cycles, or et cetera, et cetera. So that length of time comparison to the initial emission itself is really important in relationship to actually understanding what we mean by a sustainable decision or not. So life cycle thinking is key, and that's part of, again, the research. It's a really key part of why we're really sort of banging the drum about fit out and thinking of this differently. So if I could add a couple of other points on this, and then I'll probably come back to answer the question you started with, the assumptions that were being made by the sort of the whole building teams, let's say, in the industry. First of all, we're not even considering the carbon weight of fit out. So let's say they were like, let's set budgets, in our construction to build buildings with, let's say, 600 kilos of CO2. I think it's lower than that. I think it's about 550 going to be. But we're recording this the week before the first launch of the UK net zero building standard is launched. And so I can't talk about all those budgets, but it will be out, I'm sure, when people are listening to this. And so all teams have been thinking around whole building and ignoring that multiple cycle of change that goes on within the buildings during its 60 years, let's say, reference timeline. We use 60 years as a modeling kind of benchmark for all projects to benchmark in the same way.
Yeah.
And so 60 years is completely, off the scale when it comes to interior fit out. There's no interior, I mean, even a heritage interior, that stays static for 60 years unless, it is a historical research project, but everything is always changing, being refurbished. So impacts are happening all the time. And so in modern day interiors, in any home, in any office, in any retail environment, we have got rapid changes going on at the moment.
Of course.
And so ignoring that constant change of basically 100% of an interior is missing half the story. And so we were really banging the drum about saying, please, can we come to the table? Can we please, include, recognize basically the life cycle impacts of interiors and include them in the budget allocations? Because we are obviously calculating within a limited budget that we have as a sector and as a country, part of the Paris Agreement, limits to what we can emit as a country by 2050, of course, and 2100. And so there's an allocation to the construction and running of buildings. And so we definitely wanted to have part of that chunk, not to miss out and overshoot our budgets also as an industry. So making sure that we knew what the baseline and current sort of eating, of that budget is taken on by interior fit out was factored into those calculations.
Yeah. And that was kind of the point of the research, was to be able to provide industry with some benchmark data that said typically this is the amount of carbon that's associated with various elements of, fit outs in an office building. Yeah.
Yes, that's right. So there was a big call out to the sector and to anyone who has done any modeling in fit out. And I say that because fit out doesn't have the capacity, budgets, and development, because of its nature, to have done enough modeling and have enough data and enough people working on modeling of embodied carbon in fit out to provide accurate and usable data, let's say, to really be able to perform that. So, but there's a fantastic team that's come together, and I'm going to name check Zoe Glander here from Overbury and Morgan Lovell, who was brilliant at sort of pulling me in and others in, who was part of one of the sector task groups of the UK Net Zero Building Standard. And she was like, please help, kind of thing. And so I avoided getting involved because I thought I just didn't have time with all the Ska Rating work that I'm doing in the industry and other stuff. But I'm delighted, obviously, that, she's an amazing also person and professional. So it was a joy to work with her on this and others. And so we all came together to find out and try and understand what data was available in the industry, how we could use this, and how could we actually then define these benchmarks of current practice. So what does an average interior fit out for an office space count? What's the count of it, basically? What's its cost?
And it was looking at the research, it was it's really, I think, encouraging that actually it was built on the goodwill of all the people involved, right? It was kind of everybody just offered their time, did that work, did that amazing research, making it available to the whole of industry to use. And I think that's kind of symptomatic, actually, of a lot of the work that goes on in sustainability. It's kind of, a lot of it is done altruistically, and it's people just wanting to kind of make things better, which is great. It's really, really encouraging. So there's a load of work that went on there. Maybe we haven't got time to go into the detail of how all that worked, but I'll put links to the research in the show notes so people can go and have a look at it. But what were the key findings, do you think, that came out of it?
I think, first of all, that any modelling at the moment is not modelling 100% of a project in interior fit out. So that there were big gaps, and the budget, the amount, the weights that were coming basically out from any of the case studies that were being submitted were not complete. There were gaps. People were measuring what was easy and what maybe even showed them in good light. So the importance then of having the standard and having that recognized and asked for by clients is really, really important to be able to actually clean the decks on what is really the performance at the moment of projects. So I think that was really, really key.
I think that is really interesting, isn't it? That many projects are working really hard to get to a number which is kind of in line with the industry guidance that's out there, but actually it's kind of built on shaky foundations, isn't it?
Very.
Because actually we know there's chunks that just aren't included currently, or
Yes.
certainly not included in a
Yes.
thorough way.
Yes, exactly. And that's why then I took on actually to create some archetypes. So we created some archetypes in GI and Grigoriou Interiors, because I was like, and from the beginning, I felt this was going to be the way we were going to go, because I knew what kind of quality data we were likely to get in, because I'm familiar with the industry. And so I created these archetype projects of, let's say, the perfect, model
Yeah,
of a fit out project right now. And again, we're in and out of projects every day, and many different sizes and quality levels and everything. So we had a really good feel of how we could create, and we created 3 of them for different sizes of projects, because the more complex projects have structural changes inside them, have commercial kitchens, maybe higher
yeah,
materiality. So immediately that becomes a heavier archetype, budget. Whereas an average Cat B, that would be maybe fitting out 1 floor in a building, in a city centre, that would actually have a very different than performance against the
of
major
course.
sort of headquarter, type of office. So it was really important to understand and stress test against, those typologies of
Yeah,
projects.
yeah,
And also then coming back to your question earlier on about the difference between a Cat A and a Cat B. So that makes a very big difference on how much waste we're creating in the industry, and the necessity or not to actually waste materials for different selling purposes at the moment. And so the whole of the industry working on these things is really kind of putting a call out there to agents and developers to not install Cat A infrastructure, or stuff and elements, unless they've got definitely an anchor tenant that's going to take the space, and that's part of the
yeah,
design also,
yeah,
because we have so much waste from elements that are very heavy in embodied carbon.
yeah. And people probably
So
don't realize that actually that initial fit out, it goes to a certain level, but
yeah,
actually when a tenant comes in, they might say, well, that's very nice, but we don't want that stuff. So
quite
so often it will just get ripped out, and that's such, as you say, it's so incredibly wasteful, isn't it?
very
Um,
wasteful, very wasteful.
I want to just come back to
Yeah.
one other finding which I thought was really interesting in the research, which speaks to the point that you made earlier about the chair of, you replace it in 10 years or you replace it in 2 years, and this trend towards a much shorter period between internal refits.
Yeah, yeah. And I don't, and I'm going to really respond this by saying I don't think that's a bad thing. And I may
Okay.
be
Okay.
controversial by
Oh yeah.
saying that.
Okay.
I know, right? But my answer's coming from the perspective of sustainability and not just environmental performance.
Okay.
So part of a sustainable outcome of a project or a space is to consider the human needs and cultural and social behaviors, which are part of where we are today, rightly or wrongly, they're there. And so making a decision that's ignoring human behaviors and human needs and drivers is going to be unsustainable. So
Yep.
we will not sustain it. Humans will come in and override and get rid of anything that's just not suiting them or fitting them or wanting them. So, and to a degree, of course, I'm talking absolutes here, but that's a fact.
Yep.
And
Yep.
so creating a building that is not fitting and reflecting where they are at the moment, where any particular community is, will be problematic and will be changed. So immediately you'll have more embodied carbon waste.
Mm. Mm.
And so the way we change at the moment culturally is very fast, in our societies. That is reflected through what we'll call trends, through color palettes, through car design, through the
Yep.
way we come together to do work. Putting aside the very, watershed moment of COVID, of changing the way we're
Of
all
course.
working.
Yes.
But
Yes.
we do have big changes in our society that are very systemic. And so being able to adapt and reflect those, because all of those are overall improvements in how we live life. We're living in the best part of life ever in real
Yep.
terms,
Yep.
actually.
Yep. Yep.
We've never had it this good, actually. And, we've had big socioeconomic problems, absolutely. But overall, we're in a very improved state as a species. And so to be able then to support that social and well-being need and driver, we must enable changes to happen in an environmentally sustainable way.
And that's the key, isn't it? Recognizing that change will happen. So
Absolutely.
planning for that change, understanding that that's going to happen. And you mentioned Dave, when we were talking before, you mentioned Dave Cheshire,
Yeah.
who works at ACOM.
Yes.
He's done a lot of work around kind of circularity and that kind of thing. And I remember talking to him many years ago and him saying, I don't know why, when we know that a desk is only going to be used for 5 years, we make it out of materials that will last 100. Why
20.
do we
Yeah,
do, or
absolutely.
whatever? Why do we do that? So
And just to name check, I mean, finding a name check his book. I know he's done an updated book on
yeah, I've
circular
just bought it this morning.
materials. Oh, good.
Yeah,
Yes, good. Well, we'll pitching it to anybody. Put a link to it. I'm sure. I'm sure he'll be
yeah.
pleased for the shout out. But
I'm
obviously, he's done a
sure he
lot of
will.
work again over many years on these
Indeed,
issues.
indeed.
But that absolutely, and that goes back to that sort of decision and the decision making that we do about what is sustainable or not, selecting products and materials that are made to last what historically we were used to keep things, because society would change slower, right? So we did make things to last 100 years, maybe 100 years ago, has completely changed. And we must change that. We must change
Mm,
our mental attitude to what we are going to keep, accept how long we're going to keep things, but also think about whether we should keep things as long as we do. Sometimes they're
mm.
completely over I can't remember the expression. Overstay their
Over
welcome.
engineered. Oh, okay.
Yeah,
Overstay their
they
welcome.
do.
Right. Yeah. Okay.
Absolutely. Yeah. And you know what? Actually, a fantastic example I'm sure everybody can relate to is smart devices like your laptop, your phone. You know, after a bit of time, it slows down hugely, and you don't quite realize it. You know, it takes about maybe 20 minutes for your machine to start or something like. You know, everybody will have an
Everybody's been in that
experience.
position, haven't they? Yeah.
Everybody has, until you get your new one. You're like, oh my God, why did I wait so long, you know, to change, right? And so for me, that's a classic example of where we don't realize that things are slowing us down. Maybe they're even causing pain and discomfort, and we use our resilience to make do. And so environmentally, we have to support that change cycle, and we can only do that if we've designed things from the beginning for circularity
Yeah.
and low carbon or high carbon, depending on the strategy.
Course. So how can people use the output of the research then? Is that so? Is the idea they can literally dip into the research, pull out the numbers for specific elements of fit outs and build that into their kind of current way of creating whole life carbon assessments and things? Is it as simple as that?
I think
Largely,
it's
broadly, without going into too much, but that's broadly it, isn't it? Is that it?
I think okay. Yes, if you want an answer, yes or a no, yes. And I would say, please, if you're a client, if you're somebody who's involved in a project or in the purchase or tenancy of a project and space, put it in your brief. Put in a brief that you will have no more than that carbon budget in your project.
Yeah.
And that is what I would say. Use it for that. Use it because you've got no other figure to put in as a target. Use that. You know, it
Yeah.
is a very good figure. I absolutely feel confident about where it's come from, about its inclusivity and its sort of, you know, wholeness, its
Yeah.
fairness. You know, we've been fair about what we've attributed as current practice. It's really important to understand fit out is not all these big HQs. You know, there are many of them that are done day to day throughout cities on, as I said, one floor or part floor.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so please use that figure as your maximum level and not go above that if you don't do anything else, you know.
Brilliant.
So yeah.
Well, fantastic. You know, I mean, there's so much to unpick in this research because it comes in two parts. One looks at the whole fit out, and another part looks at kind of elements of the fit out. There's so much detail in there. I'd really encourage everybody to go and have a look at it. I'll put links in the show notes to that. But right now, maybe we can just round off by saying, what's next for you? What's on the horizon for you?
So at the moment we're developing basically asset, and I call it an asset. It's a whole life model of basically putting in current best practice in design and sort of delivery of fit out projects to work to the soon to be published UK whole life carbon benchmarks, or limits as they're going to be called, in there, and basically integrate that into the all of the different activities we've got in the industry. So including Ska Rating, we're updating at the moment the offices scheme of Ska Rating. It's going to be version 2. It's going to come out in Q2 next year, all being well. And that is anybody who wants to basically align any design and fit out of an office project will be able to use the scheme to basically be in alignment to the net zero trajectory. So
Fantastic.
that's, yeah, it's so
Very
exciting.
Yeah,
It's so
brilliant.
exciting, I can't tell you. And it's taken a long time for us to get here, you know, and that's why I said about not recognizing how long we two know each other, because it's taken the sort of, 15 to 20 years, that we've been working actively in this industry on sustainability, to have the knowledge, to have the system, to know how the system works, the regulatory, the supply chain, the standards, how they all work together to make such a big change. And we really do have to do that. And that's, if I can leave it at a point, I'm going to say the biggest thing that anybody can do right now is to recognize the emotional journey they have to go on. The level of change that we need to make is not a problem insofar as technology or solutions or know-how. We have all of that. Literally, we do. It's about how people will emotionally accept the truth and actually be brave enough, courageous enough to speak up, to ask for something they haven't asked before. And that literally is the emotional journey. And I see it day in, day out. And please don't be afraid. You're not alone. And just acknowledge it. Acknowledge it.
Yeah, I think that's such a great insight to finish on. It's once you delve into it, once you open the lid on this whole kind of topic of sustainability, it is absolutely an emotional journey to kind of accept it and recognize what we need to do. So Elina, thank you so much for coming on. It's been great to talk to you. Maybe we can get together again when next Ska comes out. That would be great. Hear more about that. In the meantime, this is Carbon Clarity. I'm your host, Kev Cooling, founder of Hut 22. And today I'll be talking to Elina Grigoriou, director of Grigoriou Interiors. Thanks so much, Elina.
Thank you.